Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I'm Naomi Andrade, the Executive Director of the Iucn Species Survival Commission, which we usually refer to as SSC. I'm really excited to be here at the Science Summit at the United Nations General Assembly, and especially to have convened this extraordinary panel who will be discussing and showcasing several case studies that have applied the global standards for nature-based solutions within Latin America. So it is an honor and a privilege to have you all. So thanks so much for accepting this invitation. It is important to mention that we are recording this session to make it available online afterwards for those that couldn't attend it today. So with no more preambles, I will pass to Emmanuel Cohen, who will moderate this panel. So Emmanuel, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Hello, can I see my slide? Can you see my slide? Yeah. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much, Naomi and Angela, for initiating this session to showcase good and diverse examples of nature-based solutions in Latin America. My name is Emmanuel Cohen-Shacham, and I'm leading the thematic group on nature-based solutions at the Iucn Commission on Ecosystem Management. So before we'll be sharing those examples, very interesting examples of NBS in Latin America, I would like to provide you with a brief introduction on what nature-based solutions are about by sharing some of the work that Iucn has been developing in the past few years together with the Commission on Ecosystem Management on nature-based solutions. So as general background, I would like to mention that a lot of the knowledge and the experience that have helped to develop and to shape what nature-based solutions are today within for Iucn really comes from earlier work. And that includes, for instance, the work that was done by the CBD on the ecosystem approach, which really served as the foundation for our work on nature-based solutions, but also the work that was done, for instance, on ecosystem-based adaptation or ecosystem-based mitigation, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, ecosystem services, and so forth. And I would say that it's only in the past 9 years, 8 years or so that the concept has really been defined and developed as such. So since 2016, more or less, there has been a huge surge in interest for nature-based solutions, whether it's in research through the exponential growth and increase in publications on different aspects of nature-based solutions, whether it's in practice with NBS interventions that are being implemented all around the globe, or whether it's in policy that has been become embedded in international policy, being at the center of some of the international discussions, in particular related to climate, to biodiversity, but also at the national level with national policy processes that are being developed in some countries. So the work that I will be focusing on today, as I said, is what Iucn has been doing and which has evolved from a definitional to an operational framework, and from being defined as a third of the Iucn global program into a definition, an actual definition for nature-based solutions and a list of principles that were adopted in 2016 at the World Conservation Congress, to some further work on the NBS principles, and then to developing into an operational framework with the global standard on nature-based solutions. And the cup of this, the launch of the global standard 2 years ago. So what are nature-based solutions? For Iucn, the Iucn has defined nature-based solutions, or NBS, as actions to protect, to manage, to restore natural or modified ecosystems, which address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So it's a range of actual actions underground, not something that is done in the lab, but actual actions underground that are using really natural and healthy ecosystems, as well as modified and restored, managed different types of natural processes. And they always provide benefits both for human and for nature, for biodiversity and for human well-being. And they always need to address one or several societal challenges, which we narrow down to climate change, adaptation and mitigation, natural disaster, social and economic development, human health, food security, water security, ecosystem degradation, and biodiversity loss. And as I mentioned, the ecosystem approach is really the foundation for our work on NBS. In addition to this NBS definition that was adopted by the IUCN community in 2016, there was also a list of 8 principles for NBS that should be considered together with the definition. And these principles cover several important topics, and they help to frame what nature-based solutions are and aren't really about. So it's important to know that nature-based solution doesn't replace nature conservation, but it really complements, or it is being complemented by nature conservation. That there is a possibility for NBS to create synergies in order to implement nature-based solutions with other types of solutions, for instance, like gray infrastructure in some cases, to strengthen the NBS. That NBS are determined by site-specific natural and cultural context, that they always produce societal benefits in a fair and equitable way, that they should always maintain biological and cultural diversity, that they are applied while taking into account the broader landscape scale, and that they recognize a number of different trade-offs in the planning, that we need to consider them in the planning and the implementation. And as much as possible, that they are integrated in policy actions and measures. As I mentioned earlier, it is important to know that a lot of the knowledge and the experience that was gathered and developed over the years for different types of concepts have really served to strengthen and to frame the work for nature-based solutions. And to better understand the NBS framework, what we found and its relationship with other types of concepts, we found it useful to both consider nature-based solutions as an umbrella of different types of well-established ecosystem-based and ecosystem approaches, and also to classify all of these different concepts within 5 larger, broader category. So ecosystem protection types of concept, issue-specific ecosystem-related approaches, like ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction I mentioned, infrastructure type or related approaches like green infrastructure, ecosystem-based management approaches, and ecosystem restoration approach like forest and landscape restoration, ecological restoration, and so forth. So since we have great examples of nature-based solutions implemented in Latin America, I would just like to briefly illustrate the 2 principles of here through a hypothetical case. And what we have here is a watershed that used to have what human settlements around it, a forest, a healthy coastline with the natural barrier of mangroves and a healthy wetland. But through time, a number of pressures has happened to that area with deforestation, with degradation of the coastal and the inland ecosystems, and a growing city. So these led to flooding and to problems with regards to food security, to climate change, of course, to disaster risk, to human health, and so forth. So one option is to implement a large NBS intervention that is incorporated different type of concept like forest landscape restoration, mangrove restoration, green infrastructure in the city, wetland infrastructure. And what we can see here is that there are two concepts that are, two principles that are illustrated. First of all, there is one here, the fact that NBS can be embraced, or that it can be complemented by nature conservation. Here we have a protected area that is nearby that plays an important role in connecting to the overall ecosystem and to help strengthening the forest landscape restoration. And then here we have this constructed wall, which is really synergy with different types of approaches to strengthen the NBS. I would just mention that in our 2016 publications, there are a number of different case studies that were showcased to show how the Iucn framework for nature-based solutions is both well-defined on specific aspects, but also broad enough in order to be adaptable to different ecological, geographical contexts. So you're welcome to go and see more about those case studies. Now, going back to the framework, the development of the Iucn framework, in order to make sure that the principles that before we moved from the definitional framework to the operational framework that could actually be used and develop a tool that could be used by practitioners to plan, implement, and improve what nature-based solutions and NBS interventions on the ground, it was important that we made sure that nothing was, that we haven't missed anything. So we compared the principles and the definition to different types of principles and definitions in other published framework. And what we found out is that there were actually some specific terms that were missing or completely or not sufficiently emphasized in the NBS principles, and that we had to add to the framework. And that included adaptive management and governance in NBS intervention, the effectiveness of the intervention, the uncertainty, taking uncertainty into account, ensuring that there is multi-stakeholder participation, and that there is that we take into account the temporal scale and long-term stability. So with the definition and the list of principles and this analysis, this gap analysis that we did, we could then move into developing the operational framework through a 2-year consultation process and multiple workshops and review, rounds of review and so forth. And we developed the global standard for nature-based solutions with a list of 8 criteria and 28 indicators. And there were 2 major objectives to this framework. Well, there are 2 objectives to the global standard. First, to set a common basis of understanding for what nature-based solutions are and aren't, but also to provide a robust framework and tool for people to design, to implement, to assess, to adapt, and to improve nature-based solutions. And we're really targeting, I mean, the global standard is supposed to be implemented by different types of stakeholders. So the criteria are focusing on essential aspects that need to be taken into account in a good, successful nature-based solutions intervention, like addressing one or several societal challenges, taking into account in the planning and in the implementation, the broader scale, the fact that NBS needs to result in net gain to biodiversity and to ecosystem integrity, that NBS are economically feasible and viable, that NBS equitably balance different types of trade-offs, whether it's biophysical, for instance, governance trade-offs, trade-offs related to the scale, to the temporal scales, and so forth, which can be very tricky. And that NBS have to be managed adaptively based on evidence. And the last one is that they have to be sustainable and mainstream, integrated in policy and in the jurisdictional context as much as possible. So I'll just mention that we have 3 products for the global standard. There is the global standard general report that is translated in several languages with a brief description of the different criteria and the indicators. There is the guidance report that has more detailed description of the rationale and the requirements for each indicator and criteria. And then there is the self-assessment tool that is really an Excel sheet with different tabs to help people assess how the intervention is being implemented and how to improve it. Very briefly, just to put this event in a broader context, there is a governance structure that is in place for the global standard, which has several components. And I would just mention the national and regional hubs that are there to adapt the global standard in the national or the regional context. There is the user group, which is really all the people that are implementing and using the global standard for assessing, planning, implementing their NBS. And there is here the International Standard Committee that is chaired by Angela Andrade, who is also the CM chair, and that is really in charge of the oversight and the safeguarding of the standard on the leadership, scientific and knowledge-based leadership, and on the revision of the standard. And it's really essential for the IST, for the International Standard Committee, and for the revision of the standard to make sure that they get feedback from people on the ground on what is helping or not, what needs to be improved. So the 4 case studies, I'll just mention that we're doing, Professor Adna Cappuccina and myself, who is also here, we're doing a case study collection of 27 case studies all around the globe. And the intention is both to learn from NBS intervention around the globe, to understand if there is any kind of trends, to learn from the use of global standard for NBS in specific context, and to collect this feedback of users, from users to improve the global standard. And the 4 case studies that are being presented next are a part of this, this study. So thank you very much. Here are the references, and please don't hesitate to reach out to Edna or myself for any questions. So, Angela?
Okay. Edna, could you? Okay. Thank you very much. So I will be presenting the first case study. Well, my slides are in Spanish, since I understand that most of the audience is from Latin America, but I will be explaining the presentation in English. I want to start by saying that this case study was not specifically developed using the nature-based solutions standard, because the standard, as was mentioned by Emmanuel, it was adopted by IUCN and the Members' Assembly 2 years ago in Marseille. And so, and meanwhile, we were working in the development of the criteria and indicators. But we used this case study that was one of the case studies on ecosystem-based adaptation for Colombia. That is an initiative that was developed through 2 GF projects implemented by the Colombian government together with the Conservation International, the Water Facility from Bogota, the National Institute for Environmental Studies, Hydrology, Meteorology, and Environmental Studies, and the regional environmental organizations, and of course, the local communities and the municipalities that belong to this territory. The idea of including this case study on ecosystem-based adaptation is because ecosystem-based adaptation, as defined by the Convention on Biological Diversity, is one of the main areas of knowledge that contributed to the development of the IUCN standard. So there are many things that we will see that are completely aligned to the standard, but there are other considerations that may help in the future to have a better understanding and implementation of nature-based solutions. Next one, please. So this work was developed in an area that is, according to the first national communication of the Colombian government to the Climate Change Convention, which highlighted the main areas, the main vulnerable ecosystems and areas of the country. And it highlighted that high mountains, marine areas, and some sectors were the most vulnerable to climate change impacts. So this is why those projects were focused especially in high mountain ecosystems. In Colombia, high mountain ecosystems are located above 2,740 meters above sea level. And it covers about 3.7% of the national territory. But this area is extremely important because provide most of the ecosystem services that, especially water provision to 70% of the national population, and also around 48% of this territory is under protected areas, but is highly vulnerable to water provision for the population, for agriculture, for hydropower energy. And according to the first analysis and vulnerability assessments that were carried out, there is an expected increase in temperature, and that is higher when we are above 2,700 meters. And it's expected according to the existing scenarios that for the year 2070, perhaps, if the trend is as we have it now, the increase will be about 2.5 degrees centigrade. And there is also a huge increase of extreme weather events, and there is also a trend to the melting of glaciers in the next 10 years. Next one, please. For the area that we call Chingaza, Sumapaz, Guerrero, that is the area where the city of Bogota is located, this is the area and where Bogota is located. And here you have the Andes and the high mountains that are present in this territory and that are providing most of the services, especially water provision for the city of Bogota. And here in this map, you can see the distribution and the analysis that we carried out for the district of Cundinamarca, the department of Cundinamarca. And you can see in dark blue the areas that will have more water more rainfall than what we have now, but concentrated in specific periods of time. And what we have here in brown are the areas that will have a decrease in rainfall. So this may affect the water provision, but more than that, the water regulation for the city of Bogota and the surrounding municipalities. The next one, please. So based on this, the two main projects that the Colombian government implemented through the GF was the first one that it was one of the very first projects on climate under the window of climate change adaptation under the GF, that was to support the Colombian governments in the definition of pilot measures to address climate change impacts. And so those were focused on high mountains, but also in the area of human health, specifically related to malaria and dengue. And after this project was ended in 2012, there was another project developed that was focused on the territory that I just presented in high mountains that are providing water supply to the city of Bogota and the surroundings. And that's extremely important because the population is about 10 million inhabitants. And this project had two main areas of interest. The first one was more about the provision of knowledge. So we work in the development of vulnerability assessments and increasing the knowledge on the climate change scenarios for using the R5 and R6 models coming from the climate change the International Panel on Climate Change. And the second was the implementation of adaptation actions. Most of them were already implemented in the pilot that was developed some years before. The next one, please. So as I mentioned, the conceptual framework was given by the ecosystem-based adaptation, that is the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services to help people to reduce the adverse impacts of climate change and build resilience of communities and ecosystems. And together with what is also called community-based adaptation, that is where communities are the leaders of their own process, and they are also empowered to increase adaptive capacity and reduce the impacts of climate change. So the adaptation actions work and were strengthened in this one were related, the first one to restoration, rehabilitation, and of ecological process to reduce the impacts of climate change and improve water regulation. This is also important to consider that this area is surrounded by several national parks. So most of these territories where the project was implemented correspond to buffer zones. The second component or adaptation measures were focus on adapting existing productive systems to reduce the impact of climate change and water regulation. So it was more about implementing agroecological practices, regenerative agriculture, and similar practices in the region, to promote the efficient use of water, to develop marketing options, and also address the full value chain for all the products that were developed in the area, and to strengthen the governance of the communities. And at the end, of course, the connection with the policy work. Next one, please. So here you can see what we got after the implementation of the work. It was more focused on restoration, rehabilitation, also in some areas, and you can see the process starting with the restoration process, and where all the communities were completely involved, and they were the ones who established and oriented the process in the region. The next one, please. Also, the ecological restoration to reduce the impacts for water regulation and biodiversity. So the idea here was more focused on creating areas for restoration. So you can see all the spots here where the restoration actions started. Also, the eradication of invasive species and creating specific refuges for mammals, and also giving the possibility to birds to come back to this territory, just to provide a few examples. Next one, please. And also a resilience assessment of several farms was carried out. So here we identified the main threats and the main areas that needed to be further developed with the participation of the communities. They were the ones who decided and identified the critical areas and identify also the options for improving their livelihoods. The next one, please. And also some examples about the efficient use of water in the region. The next one, please. So, and regarding policy, this was a very important outcome of the project, because the idea was to identify what we call the adaptive ecological structure for more than 12 municipalities, and this is something that is a bit aligned with the concept of green infrastructure, but it refers more to the area that needs to be maintained or restored in order to guarantee the provision of those ecosystem services. So this area became the core of the land use plans of 12 municipalities, and is very much connected with the regional plan of this department of Cundinamarca, and also was highlighted in the National Development Plan that is ending this year. And we have a new government, and this new government is taking over on this all these initiatives. And important that this is also part of the National Adaptation Plan and the National Policy of Climate Change, and it's very much connected to the national determined contribution to the Climate Change Convention and the low carbon development strategy in the country. So the specific outcomes on policy is very well developed. The next one, please. So when applying the standard that Emmanuel presented and the self-assessment tool, we use all the indicators. And important to highlight that when the project was developed, was even if it was submitted to the GF and for ecosystem-based adaptation, in those days, the GF, they said that we couldn't make an explicit reference to biodiversity because you know that all these organizations are competing and the funds are competing. So we were not allowed to make a specific reference to that. So this is why some of the outcomes on biodiversity were not strong enough, but most of the outcomes were related to biodiversity at ecosystem level, not really at species level. So the monitoring process was not really comprehensive, and we managed to do quite a lot. And the area that was not really well covered in our view is the one that is more focused on economic analysis or fulfilling all the requirements for the cost effectiveness and economic assessment due to the lack of information, and that was one of the main reasons for not having that one. But for the rest, I can say that all the criteria and indicators were addressed in a good manner. So this is the result of the application. So happy to answer and comment on the results later on. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Angela, for this wonderful case study. Manuela, you're next, please.
Yes, I am. So good afternoon. I am happy to share with you our collective work. The title of our presentation is The Role of Wetland in Drylands of North Patagonia, Argentina, under extensive grazing management. My name is Manuela Fernandez, and I work at CONICET, main government agency on science and technology in Argentina, and INTA is the National Institute of Agriculture and Technology. Next, please. In northern Patagonia, the natural environment is natural grassland, the famous Patagonian steppe. Next, please. In this environment, livestock production is composed mainly by sheep and some cows. The region is defined by annual temperature that vary between 15 and 3 degrees, and with hot summers and winters are very cold. It is a dry region with low rainfall that occur mainly in winter, and also with the strong winds. Next, please. In the area are wetlands, namely locally Machines. Machines is a Mapuche indigenous name that means flooded valley, that are environments developed in low areas of the landscape where water is accumulated. And they are the very oases with an humid soil and rich organic matter and high plant production used as forage. For this reason, the machines are very appreciated by local farmers. They represent the 3% of the total of the territory and provide around 40% of the total of the forest. Next, please. As you know, people get benefits from nature, also known ecosystem services. Concerning wetland, it provides nutrient cycling, fodder sources, drought and flood mitigation, biodiversity, wind, water erosion, carbon sequestration, seed bank, environmental stability, and also climatic stability, because it reduces the direct evaporation of water and above all by carbon sequestration capacity. Next, please. The machines in North Patagonia are being impacted by 3 major processes. Overgrazing is the overload of animal, or is when the overgrazing exceeds the carrying capacity of the grassland to auto-regenerate, desertification, and climate change. Next, please. In this context, the objective of our nature-based solution intervention are, firstly, to restore the hydrology of degraded machines with the aim of recovering ecosystem structure and functionality. Second, to restore the health of machines and to increase ecosystem services, such as climatic regulation, nutrient cycling, carbon storage, forage sources, control of water and wind erosion, and drought and flow mitigation. Finally, to address societal challenges at local and regional scale. Following the societal challenges identified by IUCN under umbrella of nature-based solution, we address specifically food security and water security, climate change mitigation via the carbon sequestration capacity of the machines, disaster risk reduction, the local community are exposed to drought, flood, volcanoes, and wind, and machines can work as drought and flow control, and also improve livelihoods of rural communities and reduce their vulnerability. Environmental degradation is another social challenge. As you could see before, in North Patagonia, there is a loss of biodiversity due to extensive grazing management, desertification, and climate change. And finally, recovering machines can contribute to the social and economic development of rural communities. Healthy machines provide forage. Animal eat the forage, and it is translated into improvement in the quality of wool and meat, and therefore into better incomes. Next, please. Our nature-based solution intervention is the wetland restoration, especially an hydrology restoration. We work at different scale, at local scale when restoring a particular machine, and it has an impact at the watershed scale. And finally, at the regional scale, because we work in different parts of the north of region Patagonia. It is an ongoing restoration practices developed by an interdisciplinary group, and the originality is that it's validated and accepted by different stakeholders. In the picture, you can see a design of the restoration wetland, named Thorn of Fish. Next, please. As I said before, our restoration initiative is an opening and participatory process where several actors are involved: scientists, technicians, academic people, we from INTA, CONICET, and University of Comahue, local farmers and native indigenous communities, Mapuches. All of them participate on the restoration process, and their knowledge and voice are equally considered. Next, please. Here you can see the timeline. There are different restoration actions along the territory with different starting year. Between 2005 and 2015, scientists and technicians evaluated the impact of local farmer restoration strategies. Faced to the degradation of machines, local communities implemented different hydrology strategies, but not always with good results, especially in terms of ecological aspects. For that, after the evaluation, between 3 years, 2016 and 18, technical and academic people start to develop restoration strategies, and in 2008, there was the first version restoration guide with an application on SAT. After the application, local farmers gave their input in terms of reaction of the result of the restoration initiative, and we start to create synergy between us as technicians and researchers with a local farmer, and we implemented different participative workshop to improve restoration strategy. On the picture, you can see the different moments of the workshop. On your left, actors are measuring together level curve of water flow. And the picture on your right, you can see the work on the field where people analyze the layout of the water channel. Move on the results. Next, please. The first big important result is the hydrology was recovery. You can see the variation of the water table level over time, before restoration processes, empty mark, and after the process, full point black. So firstly, water security was improved at the local level, at the machine restoration. And in the second time, water security was improved at the watershed level. Next, please. This led to an increase in the primary production of plant forage. On the figure, you can observe the responses of environmental parameters to the restoration practices. Part E in your left, the figure shows the aerial net primary production forage. Figure B shows soil organic matter in 3 sites, comparing restored and non-restored machine. Next, please. In addition, carbon sequestration was improved. You can see how a human and healthy machine can store more carbon than a messy machine where water is less. Next, please. Also, restored machine contributes to the soil forming. In the figure, you can observe that the machine, 5 years later, the Cauce-Pechewe volcano immobilized the ashes. In terms of support and ecosystem services, restored machines contribute to the soil formation and retention, primary production, habitat provision, nutrient and water cycle. Next, please. Restored machines produce more plant and forage for animals. Healthy machines produce better fiber and meat with a higher market value. Consequently, local farmers have better incomes and their food security is also improved. In terms of providing ecosystem services, restoring machines contribute to the produce forage, clean and genetic resources, biodiversity. Currently, there is an ongoing research work measuring the relationship between the increase of organic soil matter and humidity and to increase of epigeial arthropods. Next, please. And one important result of our nature-based solution is the active participation of local communities. Within the framework of the Argentina wetland distribution, use, and co-participatory recommendation for sustainable production project, we are elaborating and developing guides with several stakeholders via participatory and multi-sector workshop. Finally, in terms of regulating ecosystem services, restorative machines contribute to control of water erosion, flood and drought mitigation, control of wind erosion, carbon sequestration, and climatic regulation. Next, please. This graph shows the results of our self-assessment. As you can see, we have a total percentage match of 45%. Our strain or positive point is our restoration practices is adequate in terms of seeking economic feasibility. It considers the use of local resources, machinery, people, and aims to improve the productivity of farmers. Another point is the sustainability and mainstreaming. We share the lesson learned, a policy regulation and law concerning water use regulation were identified and described. And finally, biodiversity net gain and ecosystem integrity, because the wetland restoration intervention respond directly to evidence-based assessment of the state of ecosystem degradation or biodiversity loss. Our weakness is the evaluation, as you can see, is the evaluation of balance trade-off, mainly because we have not done the benefits and cost analysis for our intervention, and that is our currently challenges for next year. Next, please. And with that, I finish. I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Manuel, for this excellent presentation. So next, we will invite Ruth Bennett to present another case study. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Ruth Bennett. I'm a research ecologist at the Smithsonian National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm part of the Migratory Bird Center specifically, and our mission is to understand, conserve, and champion the grand phenomenon of bird migration. And today I'll be talking about a program launched by the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute called Bird-Friendly Coffee. And specifically for our nature-based solution, we'll be talking about building bird-friendly coffee landscapes in Colombia and Peru. So to start off, I just want to share this map of the overlap between coffee growing regions across the globe and biodiversity hotspots. Especially within Latin America, coffee is cultivated in some of the most biodiverse landscapes of Latin America. And specifically for our Colombian case study and our Peruvian case study, those areas of overlap are very tight. And coffee can, in the best of cases, really support biodiversity, and in the worst of cases, leave no room for plants, birds, or the ecosystem services, which really drive the overall sustainability of these landscapes. So I use this image here in presentations with kids all the time, asking them which of these different coffee farming systems that they think have more birds. And I always say that you don't need to be a scientist to know that the full sun monoculture here on the left, really intensified production, is going to have less space for biodiversity and wildlife than a diversified agroforestry system, such as the one that we see here on the right. And our research here at the Smithsonian really shows that this is the case. This graph here shows values of bird species that are found in different types of coffee farming systems in Peru. And we found that in full sun monoculture, where it's really just coffee bushes cultivated intensively, you can have about 61 bird species that live in and around those farms. But in what we call bird-friendly shade-grown coffee, such as the system here on the right, you can have up to 243 different species of birds that live in that agricultural habitat type. So diverse and tall shade trees are very strongly correlated with biodiversity of coffee farming systems and can support up to 4 times more birds than sun coffee, such as the system on the left. And this is really important knowledge when we think about the state of birds currently. Our center has shown, in collaboration with other research institutes, that 3 billion birds have been lost from North America since 1970, and the vast majority of those birds are migratory. Shade coffee farms are also an important overwintering habitat for these migratory birds. And as shade coffee is converted from diversified agroforestry to sun, there is a corresponding loss of bird diversity, and especially migratory bird diversity, with that transition. So in the year 2000, the Smithsonian launched a gold standard certification to identify what types of coffee farming practices best conserve birds, and then provide market-based incentives for producers to meet that habitat threshold. Our current criteria require that farms are 100% organic and 100% diverse shade farms to qualify for this certification. We have shown through over 20 years of research that farms that meet the bird-friendly certification standard have better outcomes for birds, but also other types of wildlife and associated ecosystem services. And this is a graph of what the bird-friendly certification value proposition is. So we start here on the left with the identification of high-quality habitat for birds. Then we train third-party auditors to go onto these coffee farms and verify that indeed that habitat does exist. At that point, the value proposition moves to consumers. And this value proposition doesn't work if consumers are unaware of the bird-friendly certification and do not actively select it. We found that in countries where coffee is exported, consumers that value wildlife, value environmental conservation are far more likely to pay more money for bird-friendly certified coffee. And that awareness and demand then facilitates market access for these producers with the certification to get higher price premiums, access to specialty markets, better and more stable relationships with buyers, which then incentivizes the retention of that habitat for birds. However, as we've evaluated this value proposition, there are some challenges with it and some things that we would like to improve. On the habitat side, our certification currently only looks at the farm level, but we know for most types of biodiversity, the composition of the landscape is really what drives biodiversity. Many species, because we're talking about birds, of forest specialist birds, understory insectivores, large-bodied fruit-eating birds, only exist in large blocks of forest. And so the overall biodiversity of the coffee landscape may have less to do with the habitat on the coffee farm and much more to do with the amount of retained forest on the landscape. On the consumer awareness side, we also know that we struggle to maintain consumer awareness and demand for bird-friendly coffee. And that means that not all producers with the certification are successfully accessing price premiums and specialty markets. In order to strengthen this incentive, our program is committed to raising consumer awareness of this certification, this type of farming system, and providing more opportunities to purchase this coffee. For the nature-based solution that we evaluated for the IUCN study, there were several challenges we specifically sought to address. First, the challenge that biodiversity depends on landscape composition, but certifications such as bird-friendly and incentives through price premiums tend to happen at the farm scale. Second, the incentives that our program is providing to conserve tall shade trees, a diverse shade tree canopy, and 40% canopy cover may be misaligned with landowner or industry funding priorities. Those often seek to simplify coffee farming systems, but may be well aligned with setting aside forest off the farm. So finding ways to realign what our certification is promoting and trying to create market incentives for with what landowners, producers want to do, seek to do, and what industry is often funding them to do is a more effective way to ensure retention of high quality habitat. Additionally, local policies, governmental policies, and coffee farming extension services often do not support the biodiversity conservation farming practices that this certification promotes. So there as well, we seek to better align our recommendations with local policies and local extension services because it's much more likely to be successfully adopted in those cases. So to conduct this work, we've set up a new study in 6 different sites in Panama, Colombia, and Villarrica. In these sites, we are seeking to integrate landscape compositions and forest thresholds into the bird-friendly certification standard. So we really want to use research at these sites to move beyond a farm standard to recommendations that conserve biodiversity in the landscapes. We also want to identify and promote the individual tree species with the greatest co-benefits to birds and biodiversity and coffee producers. Currently, our certification offers global recommendations and a global assessment if farmers meet or do not meet the standard. However, we know that in individual landscapes, individual tree species, different native tree species may play a different role in biodiversity conservation. So we really want to tailor our recommendations to locally relevant tree species and biodiversity responses. Additionally, we seek to co-develop solutions to reduce barriers to adoption of bird-friendly farming practices with producers and industry. And finally, we seek to strengthen incentives to adopt and retain these bird-friendly practices. So in the case study we evaluated, we focused on 3 of the landscapes where we are currently conducting research. Each of these landscapes is about 400 square kilometers, and in each one, we have conducted 8 replicas of bird surveys on 450 points and bird foraging observations, fruit phenology observations, and insect abundance observations on 110 different tree species that are commonly found in and around coffee farms. We also conducted interviews with 1,000 coffee producers, 30 workshops, and several focal groups to tailor our questions that we're asking producers and start to determine what tree species are providing best benefits for farmers, what tree species are currently the most protected and promoted in the landscape, and then to identify what types of conservation activities farmers are willing to adopt and what they require to adopt those actions. And I just want to mention that this case study is very much ongoing. We're currently in the 2nd year of the research, and we expect to continue working in these landscapes for a minimum of 2 more years, but really we would like to invest permanently to move beyond the research stage where we are right now to implementation of the co-developed conservation solutions. So I'll just mention some of the preliminary results that we've been finding. We have been able to analyze some of the bird diversity data we've collected and test it to determine how our current bird-friendly shade-grown standard compares to different landscape compositions of forest, sun-grown coffee, and shade coffee. And we are finding that in comparison to our simple shade standard at the farm level, retaining blocks of forest that are at least 20% of a landscape, and a landscape is defined in this study as 25 to 400 hectares of land. So a landscape that's relevant to a large coffee farmer or a coffee cooperative, that retaining 25% of that as forest without any trees on the coffee area is actually better for forest-dependent species than our current standard. Other types of species, however, open area specialists and habitat generalists do better in the shade coffee itself. So we are using these results to simulate different landscape compositions to create optimal scenarios for forest cover, shade coffee, and other types of land uses that farmers have already selected and are already conducting. We've also arrived at some preliminary results for which tree species are providing the best benefits to birds. This is a series of trees we evaluated in Villarrica, Peru. And I just want to point out that here on the left, Inga saltensis, one of the very common coffee shade trees, has twice the insect abundance in its leaves than any other shade tree. And that is very strongly correlated with support for insectivorous birds. So these types of results can allow us to make specific recommendations to coffee farmers and also local municipalities that are funding tree planting and restoration, so that the trees selected in those studies are the ones that will create the greatest food resources for the greatest number of insects and corresponding wildlife that eats them, really driving biodiversity from the bottom. I'll also mention that the tree species with the lowest bird diversity and lowest insect diversity is Pinus tecumani, which is an introduced pine species from Central America. This species has been heavily promoted by national reforestation efforts. It is a timber species, but it is not native to the area. And these results show that in not being native, it does not support a robust native insect community and has very little value for biodiversity. So we're able to use these results and plan to expand the analysis to include fruit and fruit-eating birds to really tailor recommendations and tree planting projects in the future to the species that will provide the greatest value to birds and hopefully the farmers that choose to retain them on their lands. This is just an example of some of the ways that we're communicating that information. We've created posters specific to each landscape with the local names and some of the leaves of the top trees that provide the best resources to the local bird community via fruits, insects, and nitrogen fixation, which is a very important service to coffee farms. Just a couple of results I want to highlight from our producer interviews. Each landscape had very different types of actions that farmers or producers were willing to adopt. In Cundinamarca, that community had very high willingness to embark on forest conservation efforts that required collaboration between neighbors. That was the only landscape we evaluated where that type of opportunity existed. The other two landscapes, farmers were much more interested in individual projects on the land that they manage, and that really will help us tailor any landscape level conservation projects that come out of this. In Santander, while farmers are most interested in working on land that they own and manage, that site had the greatest willingness to increase shade diversity on the farm. So that's also something that benefits birds, but different types of birds. But if there's no opportunity or interest in landscape level forest projects, then we obviously won't recommend those. Villarrica was the site with the greatest willingness to set aside personal land for reforestation, and each landscape had different incentives that producers requested to carry out this work. We are working with the major coffee industries in these landscapes to explore opportunities for coffee industry to fund this type of work for the industry groups to meet their objectives for carbon sequestration and carbon insetting. And here's just some photos of the types of workshops we've conducted, posters we've created to share these practices with producers. And we also, because we'd like this to be a full landscape project, are training teachers and local students in the benefits that birds have for coffee as well. Finally, just very briefly, in our assessment of the nature-based solution, we find that biodiversity net gains is the aspect in which this project performs the most strongly. That's not surprising because it was designed for biodiversity, and adaptive management is where we really struggle. The bird-friendly standard has not evolved for the 20 years that it's been in existence, and we are using the results actually of this self-assessment to change our approach moving forward. So in our next steps, we'll be actually forming local working groups with all of the major landscape stakeholders, including coffee producers, but also the major industry groups, municipal governments, national governments, and environmental NGOs, and together with them conducting spatial analyses that integrate all of our data, watershed data, social and economic data, forest and biodiversity data, to create risk assessments and opportunity assessments. And then we seek to tailor these to each landscape with a conservation plan that is co-developed with that working group that really identifies where the major opportunities are spatially explicit for conservation. And this information will be integrated into our bird-friendly standard moving forward. We will have new thresholds that incentivize forest protection. And then ultimately we will seek to fund and implement these co-designed conservation plans at the landscape level. So that's it from me. Thanks very much. And I'd just like to thank our funders, the Knobloch Family Foundation, Disney Conservation Fund, Nespresso, and Smithsonian Working Lands and Seascapes.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for another excellent case study, very different from the past ones that we've heard about. Thank you so much. So for our last case study presentation, please, Claudia, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. And hello, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to join to this panel. So I'm Claudia Cordero, Regional Advisor from the Euroclima Program, which is the European Union flagship cooperation program on climate change within the Latin American region, working with 18 countries in climate action. And the German cooperation, the GIZ, is one of the agencies that implements Euroclima, and it's supporting the resilient food production sector by providing grants for the execution of projects like the one I will share with you today. So next slide, please. So the project is about the Andean Resilience, is to strengthen small-scale agricultural production areas that are vulnerable to climate change in the highlands of Ecuador and Peru. And today I'm only going to refer to the nature-based solution experience in Ecuador. And this was an intervention of 2.5 years implemented by the NGO ACRA and the local partners like the provincial governments of Tungurahua, Cotopaxi, and Cañar, and the fund for Tungurahua for the management of paramos and fight against poverty. And the idea was to improve the value chains of milk, minor species, livestock, and family agriculture to support the conservation of the ecosystem services of the Andean paramo, and to increase the climate resilience of the indigenous communities living there. And this project was not designed as a nature-based solution itself, like the first case. However, with the global standard, we use it to help us understand the approach, the benefits, the structure. So we indeed identified it as a nature-based solution. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in Ecuador, the paramo is an ecosystem that is a source of fresh water. Its main ecological function is water regulation. It collects water from rain, fog, and glacial runoff. So many cities in the country receive their domestic water supply from the paramo, right? And peasant and indigenous communities live there and depend on it not only for the water provision, but also for their livelihoods, right? And this generates pressure to this ecosystem, pressures like to expand the agricultural frontier. There is deforestation, overgrazing, unsustainable agricultural activities. Soils are degrading and undermining the water quality. Plus, the effects of climate change have impacted agricultural production, reducing the variety, the productivity of crops, and of course, with consequences on livelihoods and food insecurity. So there is a high risk for the integrity of the ecosystem. And this was like the challenges identified, and therefore, well, the objective of the project was to strengthen these value chains, as I mentioned, milk, minor species, and agroecological production, family production, increasing the resilience of these smallholder farmers, supporting the conservation of the ecosystem. Next slide, please. So the activities included trainings, for example, to the Association of Producers on agroecological production, and good agricultural practices for small-scale farming. This is sustainable use of water, soil, waste management. Also, there were trainings trying to strengthen the organizations, like the associations of producers, like with better organization, they could access to funds, equipment, opportunities for transformation their products, and add value to take them to the market and generate more income, right? Also, silvopastoral systems were implemented, the diversification of agricultural production with the delivery of seeds or fruit, or like fruit trees, and including activities like elaborating their composting with these biofertilizers by the same producers. Local and climate change adaptation plans were also included in integrating the gender approach. They were validated with the governments, with the local governments, and for these trainings were also held with different stakeholders to strengthen these institutional capacities to develop these plans in these agricultural or agri-food value chains. And this meant that it was needed to do this vulnerability assessment the value chains that were implemented to identify these climate risks and also these respective measures, right, with this gender approach. And the integration of the climate change adaptation approach in these paramo management plans, for example, in the Tungurahua Fund, to finance these agricultural and livestock projects by training these public and private sectors and also the constituents of the Tungurahua Fund on climate change issues, and also the requirements for formulating these climate projects were also part of the capacity developed approach in the project. And yes, finally, this systematization and replication of sustainable practices. Besides the publications, the trainings, one interesting result, for example, was this multi-stakeholder roundtable with these diverse organizations at a local level, provincial level. And this roundtable was on circular economy. So people were discussing proposals or what future actions they could do for circular economy. And this shows already how these regions are fundamentally prioritizing this balance of ecosystem conservations and benefits for human well-being and biodiversity, which in the future, hopefully this will lead us also to, to approach to a net zero food system strategies, in the long term. Next slide, please. So the project had very interesting results. For example, it was clear that there were consolidated agreements. It's clear for the stakeholders that it is needed to improve these agricultural practices in the lowlands, adapting to climate change while conserving this paramo ecosystem in the highlands. And regarding this agroecological production, it was about 2,000 smallholder farmers, mostly women, who were applying these good agricultural practices for the resilience of these value chains, which led to the products in markets and income diversification, even a change of diets, because new products were available in the communities, in the local markets. And regarding the institutional strengthening, which is a very important part when you have these agreements established and these good practices already happening in the farms, then you need to integrate this into these institutional platforms or type of planning systems for the local governments. So around 6 local plans for climate change adaptation with the gender approach were elaborated together with this multi-stakeholder participation, and validated by these local governments, trying to establish them into in public investment and provide the implementation for these local plans for the producers associations. And for the sustainability, well, this in the case of the fund of Tungurahua, these paramos management plans, which are planning tools, already include this climate change adaptation and approach, aiming to improve the livelihoods of these indigenous communities that are committed with these shared responsibility agreements that protect the ecosystem. And next slide, please. So we have here the results of our self-assessed assessment with the global standard. As I mentioned, we use it to improve the understanding of the nature-based solution concept, to foster these interventions with more accountability processes, and to look for scaling up the initiatives in the agricultural sector. And we can see that we could, well, we score high in societal challenges, for example, because we had the structure of the grant. The project was designed as part of this resilient food production sector of the Euroclima program, and it was considering the needs of these target groups to improve the resilience for agricultural production, diversification of income, and conserving the ecosystem. It was done in partnership also with these diverse stakeholders at local levels, regional levels also, And it was based on previous experience of this NGO ACRA, as I mentioned, who worked before in the same location. So there was an existing network already that facilitated this communication, this engagement with the target group, making sure these societal challenges were addressed and guaranteeing also the participation of the local and indigenous communities. Also, the design and scale, the adaptive management, sustainability, mainstreaming also are kind of scoring high because of this structure provided by this grant agreement. However, we score kind of low in the economic feasibility, also because the project did not elaborate a systematic cost effectiveness study. As I mentioned, this intervention was designed considering previous experiences in the area and supporting the already ongoing interventions of the main stakeholders, like this Tungurahua Fund for the management of the Paramos, for example. And also another low indicator or criteria would be the balance trade-off, for example, because the costs and benefits identified have not been used to inform safeguard, for example, or corrective actions, right? Next slide, please. That's, yeah, just a picture to give you an overview of the landscape, the people, and the area we were working on. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. And thank you very much to all the speakers for this excellent presentation and showcasing nature-based solutions intervention in the region, in the Latin America region. So we will now go into a small Q&A session with some questions that will be posing to the different speakers. And then I would like to invite the audience, if you have any specific question you would like to ask the speakers, please don't hesitate to post it on the chat. We'll use the 5 last minutes to address these. So since we finished the last presentation with the assessment of the global standard, well, I would like to ask maybe Ruth or Angela, maybe based on your assessment of the NBS global standard, what did you feel that were the strengths and weaknesses that you could identify in your intervention? And also, how did you feel that, you know, using or implementing the global standard could really contribute to the intervention, maybe in the future or currently, and how it is being implemented? Thank you. Angela?
Thank you, Emmanuel. Well, I would say that the most important factors to positive, let's say, experiences that we had were the active involvement of community members and community organizations with a gender perspective in the design, implementation of all the adaptation measures. It was really the key for the success of the intervention. Also, we had very clear communication to the project participants regarding the objectives, the process of implementation, expected results. So a good communication strategy through all the process is essential. So I would like to highlight both as some of the most important, let's say, strengths. And that was visible, or I think one example is that considering the period of the COVID, the project had to stop during that period, but then people, they continue with their own work. So I think the empowerment of the local communities is really very, very important, because it's the only way for them to continue on their own. And that's what we expect that will happen in the future, because one of the let's say weakness that we have is that these projects are implemented during a certain period of time, and we cannot rely on grants or projects to continue. So I think empowering local communities is essential. But of course, in the future, we need to increase the support from the regional authorities and the national government to develop all the enabling conditions that are needed to guarantee the permanence in the long term.
Yeah, and I'll say from my perspective, as we went through the NBS self-evaluation, it became clear that most of the monitoring and evaluation within the bird-friendly coffee certification and also in the landscapes we're working in South America currently has happened in a very haphazard way. When the certification was first launched, did not have a monitoring and evaluation plan to assess farmer happiness with the certification, price premiums that they were receiving, what percentage of farms are receiving direct economic benefits, what percent are not. And those are things that were specifically called out in the self-assessment. So as we went through that process, it became clear that we've recently been doing a lot of assessment, but it's because we didn't have a good sense of opportunities to scale up to landscape scales. We didn't have a good understanding, a holistic understanding of what percentage of the bird-friendly supply chain was receiving direct economic benefits. And so we've started that evaluation process, and we are now putting procedures in place within our certification so that happens on a yearly basis, and those data are going to be comparable to data from previous years. So I thought that was actually an excellent thing for our program to self-identify. The other weakness that we found within the project we're implementing in Latin America is that the focus was first on the biodiversity research, then on integrating community perspectives. And had we started with focal groups and interviews and like a robust working group of all of the landscape stakeholders, we would have probably picked different questions to focus on, different tree species to study, but we did it backwards. And so then we're left in the second year of the project trying to pivot to incorporate excellent perspectives that we did not have the first year. So I think as we continue to conduct research moving forward, we will probably start first for all projects in the future with local working groups, focal groups, and from that place start to build the research questions that we pursue so that they are the most relevant to local community members. And as a result of that, we've identified formation of working groups and funding working group time to come together and work with us through the spatial analyses and the data analyses processes as our next step for this upcoming year. And I think that's something that will really increase the relevance of the results of this study, not just for coffee producers, but for multiple landscape level stakeholders. So the assessment for us really showed that municipal governments were a group that we had not actively engaged, that the Iucn framework calls out as critically important. National governments, protected areas were not part of the initial study design because we were just focused on coffee producers. But we aspire to have landscape level results that are relevant for the entire landscape, and that will only happen when we engage all of the major stakeholders in the landscape. So that's the major findings we had and the benefits to our program that the Iucn self-assessment helped us realize.
Great. Wow, it's great feedback. Thank you very much, Ruth and Angela, for your answers. Maybe Manuela, a question for you that is also related to, well, the involvement of different communities and stakeholders, communication with the different stakeholders, participation. Yes, participation that has been mentioned both by Angela and Ruth. I would like to know how well were the indigenous people, the local communities involved in the implementation and the planning of the NBS intervention, and how well was their knowledge incorporated in the planning and the implementation of the intervention. This is a point that is very important in the global standard for nature-based solution. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question. Yes, the workshops were held in various intervention areas where local communities and indigenous people normally live together. As the workshops are open, both indigenous people, Mapuches in the region, and local communities participate together with technicians, scientists, and professional men and women. We have not separated the information by social group, but we believe it is positive because all of workshop participate equally. Their voices were included at the beginning of the process. As I explained before, there was a first time of the initiative that local farmers started with their initiative, and there was a lot of problem in terms of ecological aspect. In this context, technicians and academic people went to the field work and analyzed the restoration problem, and we decide to work together with the local farmers and indigenous communities in order to improve together restorations practices. And I think that is very useful, is needed, because this exchange nourish the adjustment and improvement of the restoration protocol or guides.
Okay, thank you so much, Manuela. Maybe a question for Claudia. What were the main challenges that you had in successfully implementing the NBS intervention?
Yeah, the main challenges, just like Angela mentioned, well, you know, the restrictions from the COVID pandemic, which hit the project right in the middle of the intervention. So we had to do a lot of adjustments, not only indicators, but the provision of technical assistance and the challenging of virtuality in the rural areas and so on. So it was challenging from the provision of the technical assistance point of view. However, at the same time, well, this health crisis put in evidence, you know, the need to conserve the biodiversity, the well-being, the food security. It was a good opportunity to talk about agroecological production, you know, nutritious food to stay healthy and take care of our system. Even relating to the markets, people was very aware of the importance of these short circuits to the markets, you know, for fresh products, for also to support the livelihoods of the populations, and it was easy to see the value of these communities protecting the ecosystem and the importance of this integrity for the well-being in general, no, in these conditions. But yeah, this was challenging times, definitely.
Thank you very much for sharing this. Now I have a last question for all of you. What main lessons did you feel that you learned, either from negative experiences that you would like to ensure that you address in the future, in future implementation of NBS intervention, or the opposite, from positive experiences maybe that you want to ensure are implemented to have successful NBS intervention in the future? We'll start with Angela.
Thank you. Well, I would say that since this project started, as I explained, years before the standard was adopted, I think that in the future, the baselines should be more robust and really reflect a socio-ecological process and the connection with biodiversity. I think even if in our case that it was a climate change adaptation project, we had a very good support and very good vulnerability assessments based on climate models. I think that the connection with the other components of the ecosystems and especially the social component, I think is needed. And if that's not, is not happening, this could lead to fragmented responses and perhaps maladaptation. That is one of the worst things that you may have in any adaptation project. So I would strongly recommend to make sure that they not oversimplify the reality and have a robust socioecological assessment as a basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruth, would you like to answer next, please?
Sure. So from my perspective, I'd say on the positive side, because I talked last time about, the weaknesses perhaps of our program that were revealed through this assessment. But on the positive side, I'd say co-developing biodiversity conservation solutions with local landowners and at the landscape scale has really excellent opportunity and potential to increase adoption. So the bird friendly certification standard, when it launched, was a global standard with a one-size-fits-all solution. And we're finding that by creating research that really highlights how biodiversity responds within a landscape, we're able to provide much better recommendations about individual trees that can be propagated in a landscape that really resonate with local producers' understanding of individual tree species and with their own current uses of those tree species. And we're able to better find ways that take perspectives that producers need in terms of the uses of the trees for timber, for nitrogen fixation, for soil conservation, and then integrate those with what we know about how the trees support biodiversity. So I would say the quality of our recommendations, because they're tailored to individual landscapes, are much higher, and the adoption rates that we're seeing of the recommendations are much higher as well because of that.
Okay, thank you. Manuela, would you like to answer?
Yes, it's important to consider that our nature-based solution intervention as an opening process. Implementation requires constant adjustment and updating of the methodological proposal. For example, a runoff model, impressive climatic data, and expected direction of the environment, the wetland, after the implementation, lead us to propose a restoration protocol in a non-closed way. So in this context, we have learned that as researchers, we need to have a flexible position and consider the restoration intervention as an opening process that can be modified according with input received from the territory, that is people, that is the environment. Finally, the top-down approach is not desirable for this kind of experience, and for that we promote more horizontal approaches.
Okay, thank you very much. Claudia, please.
In our case, the engagement of the producers, the community leaders, the local and national governments participating, and the representatives of the waterfronts, the Tungurahua waterfront, for example, that I mentioned, it was a very important aspect for the success of the intervention. So this public-private communitarian management model, it's very relevant to implement strategies supporting this resiliency of the agri-food value chains with this sustainability focus. Based on this experience, I believe that for future designs of nature-based solutions, interventions in the agricultural sector, it is key to get into more details of the economic feasibility criteria, and also to identify the biodiversity net gain indicators from the perspective of the agricultural sectors that is more focused on income generation and productivity of crops, right? So these are establishing in this framework of a nature-based solution. I believe this could also unlock international climate finance to support these local initiatives that are actually in the ground, helping supporting the ecosystems conservation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. So I think we have a few questions from the audience.
Yes, we have. So we have from Lorraine, and I think it's for all of us, for all of you, sorry, do the panelists have suggestions on improving funding or smallholder grassroots agroecology NPS programs? And how do small NGOs with successful programs share results with you and other decision makers? So I start with Angela. Do you want to?
Thank you. I think that one of the most important things from the nature-based solutions standard is that we have to deal with different land uses or different components in a continuum. And I think it's not just one specific activity in isolation. I think we have to look at the landscape as a continuum. And so at the end, the idea is to have municipalities or regions that are all implementing this kind of approaches and interventions. So I think specifically for agroecology, experiences like the one that I presented is fundamental, because it's the main response to the main challenges that we have, but it's not the only one, and it works if you have other land uses or other interventions that are aligned with that one connected. Otherwise, you may increase the trade-offs in the future. So I think that this is the power of the framework, that includes different kinds of interventions, not only one.
Manuela, do you want to answer related to your case study?
Yes, sure. This challenge is our challenges. Economic challenges in our context is part of our life. So, for example, in our case, the variability of the wetland environment that needs a site-specific approach, added to great distances between technical professional center and the intervention site, sometimes more than 300 kilometers in gravel road. The complexity of the practices with the use of heavy machinery, expensive, make the theoretical and practical workshop and restoration practices not something simple to do. So normally we mobilize small funds from research projects, but also contribution from cooperative and local farmer or local centers that are interested in their work being applied and disseminated in the area. So the idea is, my suggestion is try to involve local people and use local resources.
Thank you, Manuela. Ruth, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. From the coffee sector, for any NGOs or producers in the coffee sector that want a good platform to publish the results of things that have been successful either on individual farms or in small landscapes, the Sustainable Coffee Challenge is a global network that provides an excellent platform to do that. It's primarily made up of coffee roasters and coffee traders, but there are quite a number of individual coffee producers and NGOs that work in coffee landscapes that participate as well. And it's a platform to publicize commitments at the producer or NGO level towards greater sustainability of coffee production landscapes, and then report results on those on a yearly basis. There's several networks or working groups that are associated with the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, including a forest and climate action network. They have monthly meetings and invite individual producers or members to share results. So Smithsonian regularly presents there, and it's also an opportunity to access industry funding or to design proposals in collaboration with larger industry groups. So for the coffee sector specifically, that would be my recommendation. And then For me personally and the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center and Bird Friendly Coffee Program, we would love to hear from you. We can be reached at birdfriendly@si.edu or Googling us. There's a contact form as well. And we're always interested in learning more about success stories that individual producers and small NGOs have had, and then looking for ways to work together moving forward.
Thank you, Ruth. And Claudia, from your case study?
Yeah, my suggestion is to look for key alliances with stakeholders already in the region. For example, in this case of Ecuador, the alliance with the Tungurahua Fund for the management of the Paramos was key, because they already do this work and they can provide this funding for these initiatives from the stakeholders. Also, the private sector is more and more getting into the sustainability approaches, and they can also finance initiatives. And for that, a very practical suggestion is like to use this global standard in order to put this experience in this common language that is more and more gaining more traction. And the idea is to be able to speak the same language and access to funds through these nature-based solutions, showing these benefits and co-benefits for these many areas. So use this this global standard in order to reach out to where these opportunities for international funds are also there. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. And for the last question, we have to be brief. We only have 5 minutes. So someone asked, when you have small landing holdings growing different produce, how was possible to align all stakeholders at the landscape level? I don't know if someone wants to respond first.
Well, I can do.
Okay, Manuela.
So that is our challenges for us,
Yes.
is to promote a good dialogue between actors that work from different approach and have different interests. For example, provision administrators, regulatory bodies, and institutions differ sometimes, and a lot of time, from local communities in terms of objective and intervention. So here, as researchers and scientists, we have a crucial role in listening to all parties, explain the objective, and promote agreement. So that is, I think, the key is try to promote this kind of conversation and agreement.
Thank you, Manuela. Ruth, it's the same product, but you have different characteristics in the farm, so.
Absolutely. A lot of the landscapes we're working in addition to coffee production, have corn, beans, plantain, oranges, passiflora species, and each type of producer has different considerations. Many types of agricultural products cannot be produced with any shade at all. Very small holder farmers essentially have no opportunity to set aside a portion of their land to regenerate because there's not enough land. So understanding different perspectives from different types of producers, different types of cultivation styles is really critical to finding opportunities that will work. And I think it's essential to understand that no solution, no type of conservation intervention is going to be appropriate and adoptable by all types of farmers. But the more types of people you have at the table in the discussions, the more people that are invited to participate in the process, the more likely it is to creatively think of types of solutions that will work for other types of producers. So I'd say from the coffee perspective, we may have solutions that work really well for large coffee farmers that aren't appropriate at all for smallholder coffee farmers, but for any type of producer, there are actions that will be appropriate at that scale. Or educational materials that will resonate better with different producer groups. So for us, the challenge and the opportunity is to invite as many types of people as possible to participate in the process, and then the outcomes are much more likely to be relevant to multiple types of producers.
Thank you, Ruth. And very quickly, Claudia, do you struggle with the same challenges?
Well, there are different stakeholders, with different interests, but it's easy to find one single objective. Like in this case of Ecuador, the objective was to support the Paramo conservation, because everybody needs water at the end of the day. So through this common objective, you can work on and move forward. And then it's not just the objective of the water provision, but these different platforms that are already in roundtables in these local platforms, also begin new conversations like the one I mentioned with the circular economy, for example. And this brings, these platforms where people can participate and share their different views, but finding this common objective.
Okay. Thank you, Claudia. So Naomi, the floor is yours.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. I think Emmanuel wanted to say a final remark, so go ahead, Emmanuel, if you wish.
Yes, I just wanted to thank all the speakers, and I'm super excited about this study on the global standard. I'm really excited about, Edna and myself. I think I can talk on your behalf about learning about all these case studies all around the globe, implemented in completely different context. And for anyone interested in learning more about experiences, not only in the Latin America region, but throughout the globe, will be, I hope, finalizing this study by the end of this year. So please reach out to us and check the space of the Commission on Ecosystem Management at IUCN. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Naomi.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists and attendees. Bye-bye.